All right. People are entering the Zoom sphere, and it is then my moment and great privilege to welcome you to A+D Thursdays, to the 6th program in A+D Thursdays here hosted on a Tuesday. My name is Shannon Jackson. I'm Associate Vice Chancellor for the Arts Plus Design at UC Berkeley and Hadidi Professor. We have a large group joining us today, and I wanted to be sure that all of you know that this series sits inside a larger public course that my office created in order to introduce students to a range of creative forms across visual art, performance, film, media, literature, and design. And that this spring's iteration is focused on the field of time-based media art. The spring semester is allowed to have that focus because thanks to a generous donation from the Cramlick Art Foundation. The Cramlick Art Foundation, founded by Pam Cramlick, a Cal alumna, and her husband, Dick Cramlick, is committed to education and public programming in the field of time-based media art. And we, my students, colleagues, and our wider community are grateful for their generosity and vision. This is a course that also opens to the public every week. And so here we are, open to the public. And I welcome all of you today. Even if we do so virtually now, it is a place and always an incredible honor to be able to gather together around these themes. We've had an incredible roster of speakers already and look forward to more, including up ahead, Barbara London, Steve McQueen, and Cal alumna Shirin Nishat, and many, many more ahead. Indeed, at a time when we are enduring a degree of global upheaval in terms of our health, in terms of issues of politics and environment, many of us are rethinking anew what it means to gather in general, especially as we gather online so often today, thinking about the possibilities for connection and disconnection on the screen. As such, the exploration of time-based media art actually feels all the more urgent now and all the more pressing. Indeed, in many ways, the scene that we're in now makes questions of time, questions of mediated connection, extra relevant. Before I proceed further in introducing our speaker for today, I also want to acknowledge another dimension of the political history of our gathering. That is the political history of the land on which our campus stands. UC Berkeley is sited on the ancestral and unceded land of the Ohlone people. As we gather on our campus, online and offline, we recognize not only the Ohlone history, but also that the Ohlone people are flourishing members of the Berkeley community and of the Bay Area community more widely. I now have the great privilege of introducing an artist who knows something about what it means to excavate the fraught histories of one's land, as well as someone who knows what it means to deploy time across a range of artistic practices. William Kentridge is a South African-born artist who has achieved justifiable renown for his ability to work and to intervene artistically across a range of forms. His artistic practice includes drawing, text, performance, music, theater, cinema, video, and all the while he deploys these media in relation to themes drawn from and rooted in politics, science, literature, and history. I'll not reread the entire biography we have shared online for you to read, but I do want to highlight the extraordinary range of his practice. Kentridge's work has been seen in museums and galleries across the world, from MoMA to the Louvre to Whitechapel, as well as in major biennials and festivals, including Documenta and Venice. His extraordinary art world practice is matched by an extraordinary practice in the performing arts, including opera and theatrical productions at the Met, at Opera de Lyon, the Salzburg Festival, La Scala, as well as with the legendary Handspring Puppet Company. The list of prizes he has won is too numerous to go into here, but they again honor his work across a range of forms, and they've been bestowed across a range of countries. In 2016, Kentridge founded the Center for the Less Good Idea, a space for responsive thinking about experimental, collaborative, and cross-disciplinary art practices and mentorships, and it's a site that has become all the more relevant and urgent and necessary in our current moment. So I could go on, but instead I'll pause for a minute in order to reach out to the assembled audience. The audience today is diverse. It includes a range of art leaders and distinguished art collectors from around the world. It includes a range of our Bay Area colleagues, Berkeley faculty. It also includes my students, many of whom are encountering Kentridge's work for the first time. So as we proceed, I think I'll ask all of you just to recall the moment when you first saw a Kentridge work. For me, it was in the 90s when I was a graduate student at Northwestern at an exhibition at the Block Gallery. And I remember my friend, who was the gallery manager at the time, taking me by the hand and pulling me in and saying, "You've got to see this." We watched what I would come to understand to be drawing for projection until the real ended, and I never let go of her hand. I simply did not realize that anyone was allowed to make work like that. And I was so glad that he had granted himself permission. So I hope all of us can remember that energy, the urgency, the delicacy, the sense of wonder that so many feel when they encounter Kentridge work, and bring that energy with us to the Zoom room, and bring that energy to, even if you're muted, as you help me welcome William Kentridge to the screen. William.
Thank you, Shannon. What a pleasure to be with you all, sort of late at night here in Johannesburg and noon, I presume, in your part of California.
Exactly.
Good.
So this is our lunchtime series.
Okay, well, I hope everybody has their lunch with them. I'm ready to enjoy that.
So William, as I said earlier, this is a course that we created and a lecture series that we created in order to work across and expose students to a range of forms across literature and performance and cinema. And as I said to you on the side, I actually don't think that there's any artist in the world who has more to say about more art forms than you. I really don't. So it's an incredible pleasure and honor to welcome you. To launch us and to make sure that we have sort of a scene setting that keeps everyone on the same page, I wonder if you could start by just sharing a sampler of some key works, or at least projects that feel key to you today.
Okay, good. So I thought that what we would start with, just by taking 2 minutes to look at 4 different projects, so 8 minutes altogether. Great. I have my phone so I can check we don't go too long in each one, otherwise the whole time will be spent looking at things. And then those will stand as kind of notes for everybody to keep in their head, and when questions come, we can refer back, we can look at more of these particular pieces. There's a computer full of other pieces here waiting to be shown. But I'll start with seeing you so kindly mention the drawings for projection. I thought, let me start by showing one of these pieces. It's a piece called City Deep, made about a year ago. And it's about the Johannesburg Art Gallery and mining in Johannesburg. But I'll just play the first couple of minutes just to get
Thank you.
People understand what we're talking about when we talk about drawings for projection and charcoal animation. Okay, Chris, we can. Yep. Sounds on. Okay, back to me. Okay, so that's a fragment from City Deep. I'll next show you, so that's all drawing that's turned into a film. Then I'm going to show you a fragment again, and again we'll just time at 2 minutes and I'll stop when the 2 minutes is up, of a piece which is, again, a projection piece. It's normally shown with 3 screens showing the piece, and it's a piece about 1968. So it's about, it relates to student protests in the United States and in France and in Europe in 1968, but it is seen through the lens of the Cultural Revolution in China that was also very connected to this era that ran from before that till the early 1970s. And this is a piece that uses a mixture of drawing, of ink, of text, and of filmed performance. Okay, switch across. Okay, so that was Notes Towards a Model Opera. And then the third thing I'm going to show you is a piece which is a record of a live performance. It's a film of a performance called The Head and the Load, which was performed, which we made about 2 years ago. It would have been in performance over this last year, but COVID has made that impossible, both to perform it in South Africa and for the venues which had been planned in other parts of the world to happen. It was first seen at the Armory in New York and at the Tate Museum in London. And it's a large-scale performance that in the end became about Africa and the First World War. And it's part of a series of it's one of a number of projects which I've made over the years that look at both the history of colonialism and the legacy of colonialism, and particularly the paradoxes and contradictions of colonialism. So again, with this one, I'm just going to jump through a few different sections, and we can come back to it later in more detail if people would like to see that or there are questions about it. And we can cut to this.
Logo kusakata umbombo. Human sustenance. My chest has the power to expand without limit. And yet, I am advised to adopt the humility of the cripple.
I assure you, we are not.
Africa Calais, Africa Calais, Africa Calais, Frafide no sorona Calais,
Abelungu got there. Got there, Mabelu. Abelungu got there. Got there, Mabelu. Abelungu got there. Got there, Mabelu. Abelungu got there.
Abelungu got there.
Got there, Mabelu.
Got there, Mabelu.
Abelungu got there.
Abelungu got there.
Got there, Mabelu.
Got there, Mabelu.
Abelungu got there.
Abelungu got there.
Got there, Mabelu.
Got there, Mabelu.
Abelungu got there.
Abelungu got there.
Got there, Mabelu.
Got there, Mabelu.
That's the shit thing. That's the shit thing. That's a piece of swag. That's a piece of swag. That's the shit thing. That's the shit thing. That's a piece of swag.
And the fourth piece, just to give us an idea, will come out of the Center for the Less Good Idea. The Center for the Less Good Idea is an arts incubator space that I started with other people in Johannesburg 5 years ago. And it's a place where artists, musicians, choreographers, theater makers, directors, writers come together and work on what happens when these people come together. So we'll talk more about the Center for the Less Good Idea, but I'll show you one fragment from it, or a couple of very short fragments from it. These aren't pieces that I've made. They're pieces which I've helped mentor and bring into being, but they have their own directors, their own writers, their own constructors. So let me 2. Okay. Right. Okay, so that gives you an idea of some of the range of different things and sets the agenda for things we can talk about. So Shannon, over to you.
Oh, right. Fabulous. And it sure, I think that gives us plenty to start thinking about. One of the questions I had started to think about beforehand and now is queued up even more urgently is, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about some of your early training before everything, especially around Lecoq, what might have happened there, as well as your investments in puppetry. I mean, especially the third piece, but all of the pieces, you sort of see, what is it that you learn from puppetry about animating an object world or making humans puppet-like almost?
My trajectory to sort of being where I am now was mixed. I started doing fine arts at university, but dropped out after 6 months. And in fact, my university training was in politics, political theory, and in colonial history. But at the same time, I was going to a small art school, a private art college, just in evenings, evening drawing lessons. And gradually that got more and more what I was focused on, and the university side got slightly less. And at the same time, I was working with a student theater group, acting. And I was given good advice, or I was given advice from friends who said, this is ridiculous, you can't be an actor and someone making drawings, you're going to be a master of none, choose what you want to do and focus on it and try to be good at it. So I thought, okay, my drawing wasn't going anywhere. I'll give that up and I'll try just to be an actor. So I closed my studio, stopped doing etching, and went to theater school. Went to the École Jacques Lecoq in Paris for a year, where I discovered after 3 weeks that I should not be an actor. But it was nonetheless a fantastic year's course. I mean, they do offer a 2-year course. I just did the 1-year course because I knew I wasn't going to be an actor. But I realized afterwards that that was the year in which I learned much more about what it is to be an artist than any of the other formal art training or informal art training I'd had. And it had to do with understanding the origins of gestures, where they come from, in the belly. What is the energy needed to launch a gesture, which is true whether it's an acting gesture or whether it is the mark that is being made by a piece of charcoal. What is the origin and what is the necessary distance? What is the necessary trajectory of it? What is in the heart and what is decoration at the edges? And even if I teach drawing now, which I do very rarely, it's primarily using theater exercises rather than drawing exercises that people would do. And I think of understanding that the embodiment of the work. To be an artist in the studio is not to be sitting at one's computer. It has to do with what is the nature of the body moving in space, whether it's drawing or performing. For me, that's an essential part of it. One has to find strategies in the studio to get away from smart thinking. There's a need for creative stupidity in the studio. That's why it always seems to me that art schools in the United States and in Europe are very hard, because the premise is usually that you start with the essay, and when you've worked out the idea, then you do the work, rather than the opposite way, which seems to me the only way to work is to make the work and then see what the work tells you about the world and obviously in the end about yourself. So to have the essay or the interpretation as one possible interpretation at the end of the process, not at the beginning. So this theater training, which was a training in improvisation and movement, not in analyzing text. There were no texts used. It was not about doing plays. It was about what is the meaning conveyed by the body in movement.
As somebody who began life in performance, I have to agree. And it's interesting to think about that notion that even though you work across all those media, you still see this primary connection in gesture, and that you even find a temporal quality to something like drawing or the visual image that's often.
Well, a drawing is always the record of its making. So, I mean, the marks that are there are a record of where your hand has moved to make them, as well as being just the finished object. And I suppose that's why I enjoy animation, because all stages of the drawing are provisional. They're going to get erased, adjusted, changed, and that the making of the drawing is turned into the ephemeral form of time.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And
right.
by reverse, the ephemeral form of time is turned into the hard, practical material of paper, of charcoal, of erasure, as well as, of course, into the weight of a roll of film.
Yeah, so a constant tacking between time and space, or duration in the object world. So as somebody who then is known for having created, to some degree, almost new media in order to explore this intersection that you're talking about, I wonder if you could say...
No. Let me stop you there. It's not in order to explore this new media. It's to do these different activities which came to me one way or another. And in the end, maybe there is a new medium to be explored.
But you don't pursue that. We're not pursuing a new medium.
Opposite.
Yeah.
The trajectory is the opposite. It's never thinking, what must I express? It's to say, let me work on something that's itching, something that's an urge to do, and see what it becomes, both in terms of image, but often also in terms of medium.
Yeah.
So there always has to be an impulse, and then a medium in which I want to work, whether it's charcoal or Indian ink or torn paper, or just pure performance. There has to be this meeting of a first idea or impulse, and then a medium in which to think about it, through which to think about it.
Right. Can you describe examples where you went down a road of experimentation and you found the medium resisting you, or other moments when you found sort of an aha moment when something really clicked?
Yeah, there are definite times when suddenly something gels. One has to be very open to the moments when things are going wrong, because you know, if you started drawing really well, you started with a lot of energy and brio, and if it's looking really good, you get more and more anxious about spoiling what you've made. And you get, instead of a whole body drawing, it becomes just the arm, or it just becomes the elbow, or it just becomes the wrist, or just the knuckles. So sometimes if a drawing's gone really badly, then you think, what the hell, let me destroy it. Let me keep working in a very rough way, and then something new starts to emerge.
Creative stupidity. Yeah.
We did a project with a scientist about looking at Peter Gallison, a great physicist, trying to do a piece about the nature of time, or make visible ideas about time. And we tried various things of making, turning the duration of sound into a way of measuring time. And we tried all sorts of making an artificial tuba with a rubber hose, and we failed miserably at that. And then we had the idea, okay, in the exhibition, there was a little anteroom with it. We'll let that anteroom be the room of failures. Everything we've tried that didn't work, and we put it in the room of failures. But as soon as we started that, everybody only wanted to make failures. And of course, no one could.
Yes, they failed at failing.
You can't do that deliberately. We didn't fail better, we failed worse. So there are certainly times when something is begun and gets abandoned, but less than one might think. Very often things change in mid-course, and things which were at the edges come into the center, which is, you know, what the title, the Center for the Less Good Idea is about.
Right.
You know, if the good idea is not going to work, rather look for smaller ideas at the edges that you would ignore if you were too set on the key first idea. And it's about being open to what you're doing. It's a bit like the psychoanalytic belief that you need to rely and have faith in the idiocy of free association. Don't censor yourself in advance. See what there is there, and then see if it can be found to make a sense, if there is a reason for it. And I suppose the belief is, in the end, it's always going to be about you, the artist. Whatever you think the subject is, you think this is a subject about showing this piece of history or that element of society. In the end, it's always a self-portrait of the longue durée. And maybe that self-portrait will reveal that you are an altruistic person. It may show that you're a proud person. It may show that there's a certain limit to understanding. But in the end, it's going to be about who you are, as well as all the other things that are in the artwork.
Yeah. Thinking about how it ends up becoming about your own pursuit in the end, and the pursuit of yourself in the end, can you also, just following up some questions that are queuing up in the chat, about what it means then to take your practice to a collaborative space, and perhaps even to describe, one person is asking what your role is, or how you even construe your role in the different pieces that you show. Do you call yourself a director, a playwright, a cinematographer, a painter?
Okay. So I'm a good chooser of collaborators. I think that's something I have a talent and skill for. There are many collaborators I've worked with for many, many years. And to give an example of how that would work, when I started working in the first opera I did, I was told I needed a costume designer by the opera house, as well as a set designer and lighting designer. All the things that we'd sort of done ourselves with Handspring Puppet Company. And they suggested I talk to 3 costume designers, and 2 of them arrived with beautifully made drawings, with really very clear drawings of how they were going to do this production. And I was terrified. I thought, okay, they're so certain. Okay, I better take one of these, because then I'll follow that and I'll know what I'm doing. And at a certain point, I realized, no, that was ridiculous. I didn't know how I was going to do the production, but I didn't want to be shoehorned into another vision. And then the 3rd person came, and she said, I'm sorry, I don't have any drawings. I don't really have any ideas yet, but I know that by the time the production's finished, we'll have beautiful costumes. And I thought, oh, thank goodness. Here's someone who can put doubt and uncertainty right into the center of the practice, rather than trying to be pushed at the side. And in the 10 years since then, we've made, I don't know, 10, 15 different projects together, never with the formal costume drawing made, with different collages and different things we put together. And there are always very beautiful costumes at the end. So it's the same, the set designer starts with a whole lot of cardboard and cutting up cardboard and making very rough models, and we play with these and find what it should be. With the larger projects like The Head and the Load, this was just 60 people across this very large stage. It started with an invitation for that big stage, the room at the Armory in New York, which is this 85-yard wide room. And we thought to then make a piece which would be extremely long.
Mhm.
But I'd just come from doing a performance and a project on the Tiber River in Rome, in which our opening performance was in fact a concert that walked along the banks of the river for 600 yards. And so suddenly only 85 yards, I thought, oh, this is a miniature, we can do that. Of course, we couldn't, it changed very differently. So I started by inviting the composer, the designers that I work with, the video compiler and editor, video designer, to say, look at this space. We were in New York for another project. Let's think of something to do to fill the space. And then various elements, the idea of a procession on such a long piece came in, and the shadows for the procession. And we needed instruments that could move across the stage. So we built a box to put a small chamber orchestra in. I asked some dancers to start working with us, and we found the astonishing Gregory Makoma and Tulani Chauke, who did this piece together of the Wounded Man dance. And both of them I'd met first in another project they'd done at the Center for the Less Good Idea. So there were a lot of people who came out of that came into this production. In the production itself, most of the characters, most of the people on stage are characters developed by the performer. So it's not as if there's a written role and they learn the role as an actor. They're the people who develop the role. There was one, Hamilton Dlamini, fantastic, one of the great actors in South Africa, who ended up being a general, playing the part of a general. And for him, what made all the difference was being given a tiny little cardboard hat that he wore at the side of his head, based on a photo of African soldiers from the First World War. And as soon as he had that little hat on his head, his whole posture changed. He knew exactly who he was going to be and how it was going to work. So there was a whole section of it, of a dance that was performed in the northern part of the country from the First World War, of Africans who'd been to France, to the Western Front, but hadn't been allowed to fight, but came back with stories of the Scottish regiment. So it's a dance which is performed by people and by their descendants now in kilts. And it's a kind of a dance of different kinds of marching and saluting, which I'd never heard of, but he described, and then we found on the internet, and that became a very important element of the project. So the authorship is spread in many different ways. The overall task of organizing, shaping, making the decisions at the end. I mean, the day before the dress rehearsal, everybody was allowed to name one scene of the 18 or 19 which they thought we should take out. And I realized if I listened to everybody who'd made their suggestion, in fact, we would have a piece 15 minutes long, that 13 of the 18 scenes would have been excised. So at a certain point, I know though you don't like that scene, but we're doing it. We're just going to make it fantastic. And we proceeded in that way. So there's a huge space for uncertainty, for my uncertainty.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, it has to reach a finality of what the performance or the film or the drawing finally is.
Yeah, so choosing collaborators is itself a creative act, and choosing collaborators that are comfortable with uncertainty seems essential. What is when at this point in your career, perhaps it almost seems to me that these projects require you to come with your own infrastructure. I wonder what it like, if it feels different for you, or if it's a different process for you when you're creating one of these works, large interdisciplinary hybrid works in performance or on the screen, and doing so at the Armory versus at the Met Opera, in a gallery versus on a river, if you also need a different kind of collaborator when it comes to
you do.
venue and the infrastructure there.
If you're working in an opera house, then in you can describe it in two ways. On the one hand, you're the hired hand. You're the director who's called in to direct the opera they want to be seen, and they're doing all the producing and all the doing. I prefer to think of the operas as this extraordinary gift that the opera house gives, saying, here's a canvas 17 meters wide, 18 yards by 15 yards high, and come and make a moving drawing on this for an hour and a half or 2 hours. But not only that, we're going to throw in an 80-piece orchestra with a great conductor for you to use. And we'll bring in some of the best music ever written and 15 of the great world singers and a chorus of 70 people and the resources of the costume shop and the set building shop, and come and make a 2-hour drawing for us. So I think of it more in those terms, but obviously it is constrained by the particular opera. Sometimes it's my choice, sometimes it's the opera house's choice of what that would be. With something like The Head and the Load, you're starting from scratch. So that is building the whole company. So it's finding producers, and there's a company in New York that we use on all of these kinds of projects like the Tiber and in Rome, who produce artist projects and many other things. The office in New York. And then, as it were, making a whole company that exists for that project and there's a big overlap. I mean, in the design and creative side, there's a core group that have been working with me on many, many different projects. And then others that are only there for that project, performers, musicians that will only be working on that project. And the company certainly doesn't exist between projects. I don't have a theater company. There's no ongoing company at all. Because often there's a good year or 2-year gap between, it's usually 5 years between operas.
Right.
Because they take about 3 years to make, but also for all the other projects that need to happen.
Right. I wanted, maybe we could shift just a little bit now,
Sure.
But stay with this theme of uncertainty and doubt to talk a little bit more about politics and
Sure.
especially just as somebody who was raised by in an anti-apartheid family, somebody whose work, is addressing student movements, is addressing the paradoxes of colonialism, but also the fact that you talk a lot about uncertainty and ambiguity. And I wonder about that sensibility next to also the impulse to address political themes and social themes. Some might think that that's not a viable political option, to be ambiguous.
Well, I think there is a polemic, and the polemic has to do about contradiction and the absurd in the political.
There you go.
Not the absurd in the sense of being the stupid or the foolish, but understanding circumstances in the world that are only best described by the breakdown of logic, by an illogic having its own trajectory. And apartheid was a key example of this, where the basic logic behind it was completely flawed, but then this false logic gets taken to its nth degree. I would think that the absurd is the appropriate form in which to make an accurate description of what's happened in the United States over the last 4 years. And so there is an argument about the uncertainty of politics, and that each time there's a claim for certainty, it's always an authoritarian claim.
Yeah.
Behind it, there always is a shout, and there's a need for soldiers with their guns. And that's been the way from Plato onwards, throughout the Enlightenment also. So it's a result of seeing the disasters of certainty, and the disasters of the certainty of colonialists, the disasters of certainty in Cambodia, in different parts of Africa. That one's only hope is to actually undo the violent authoritarian nexus of certainty.
Yeah, and hence the less good idea seems actually more trustworthy than the
But it's less efficient. It's certainly less efficient, and it's obviously it's not really a program for direct political action. It's a metaphor. Even the whole organization, the whole project is saying, here is a utopian way of thinking, not expecting it to be an actual blueprint for political action, but it's a blueprint for seeing how the world can operate and what happens when people come together in this different way.
Is there any a moment, perhaps from any of the pieces that you just shared, or another project where you sort of feel this intersection, or can sort of elaborate how you see uncertainty in the political sphere being exposed?
Yes, so I'll show you again. It's a fragment. I'll go back to it, and I'll show you
Thank you.
in the head and the load. Okay, you can keep their sound. Okay, so you can hear me. Okay, you can hear me even while you're watching.
Right.
So this is a sequence in which Gregory here is sort of being shown to march and to salute, and it's what I would call a kind of spasm of history. He's not certain, do I join the war? Do I resist the war? Is it my war? Is it someone else's war? And this corresponds to the political statements of African leaders at the time of the First World War, some of whom demanded the right to go and fight with the French in Europe in a level of equality, and others who said, why should we go and fight a European's war, white man's war? Let rich bankers and shopkeepers go and get killed. And so it was a moment of moving and not moving. To some extent, it just had to do with posture as a way of embodying this question.
Yes.
Okay, we can jump back.
Thank you. Perfect crystallization. We have so many questions brewing.
Okay.
I want to be careful. But before going on, I just wanted to go back just a bit to the Center for the Less Good Idea.
Sure.
It was founded in 2016, has already produced a number of projects, and then also is doing a lot of very interesting work right now in the COVID moment. And I wonder if COVID moment in a moment when we're also addressing a whole lot of issues politically around race, 400 years of slavery here, the legacies of colonialism across the globe. I wonder if you could say just a bit more about how you see it operating in this particular, in the last
moment.
year of 2020.
Well, the way the center works, obviously a question of any organization, particularly in South Africa, but anyways, who are the gatekeepers, who makes a decision, which artist, what the agenda will be, how that works. And the way we've dealt with this here, we have two animateurs, they called, who are not quite artistic directors, but they're the people who have to have the energy and the focus to keep it going. Palapala Okeditse is one, and Bronwyn Lace is the other. And you either usually have the normal pattern for arts organizations here would be you would have a committee, and you would then have submissions of proposals, and then the committee would decide which proposals should be supported. And you would have a long argument as to the makeup of the committee, how many people should there be, how many are women, how many are trans, how many are white, all of these different categories to try to do it. And we decided the way we would work would be in a simpler way, in which there are never proposals requested and there are no committees. Each season, we choose new curators. And it's the job of these curators to invite artists, musicians, people they know who they think would be interesting to show something to other people in Johannesburg. It's primarily Johannesburg based. And then the next season, there are other curators. So it's not as if the one curator is always choosing the same people. There are many people who've chosen to come back and do other projects at the center over the years. So it's not as if it changes completely. But it means through the system in the 5 years, we've had over 500 different artists, musicians, choreographers, dancers who've come and performed and participated in the different programs at the center. Some very senior in their field, some starting out. It's not an outreach program to community. Some of the projects people want to do are community-based projects. But it's really in South Africa, if you're looking for funding for an arts project, almost always it has to come with some demonstrable social good. If we do this piece, it will lower mother-to-child transmissions of HIV. If we do this piece, it will increase people's understanding of deforestation. And poor artists are forced into shoehorning the projects they want to make into these different social categories. And we said, that's fine. Many of the artists, that's how they make a living and that's what they do. But this will be a breathing space where we will favor the short form. So we did one season of 11-minute epics. Every piece, there were 40 pieces. I think each piece was just 11 minutes long. Sometimes the pieces are shorter, sometimes longer. But the point is that the trust is in the curator finding the people and accepting that some of the pieces won't be successful and won't be that. But I suspect our failure rate is no higher than that of people who have committees and checking and all sorts of other ways of doing things. So we keep ourselves quite small. Our spaces we have different spaces in the downtown Johannesburg, where I also have a studio. And we can fit, before COVID, we could fit maybe 150 people into a room. In COVID conditions, we wouldn't get more than about 35 or 40 for a small performance. Even though it's been almost impossible to do performances over the last year, we've had one or two on Friday. There's a music performance, which will have a small audience.
Sounds dreamy.
We have no real prospect of vaccines coming here for months and months and months. So everybody's trying to find a way of getting on with their lives under the conditions. So we don't really have a lockdown. Everybody tries to take care of how they operate in the field. I mean, most of them, I think at one stage when our first lockdown ended, and everybody was allowed to go back to work, this was in about June last year, we came back to work, and within about a week, 13 of us in the studio all got COVID. So after that, we were a post-COVID studio. Enough of us had had it to feel we could work comfortably together. Now we've got new variants, and it's not yet certain if our immunity is still strong or not. So we're a bit more cautious. But so that's the way and I mean, some of the people who wanted whose pieces are done are very strong and very clear politically, not nearly as wishy-washy and as vague as I am, who have very strong things that they want to say. And that's their motivation. And there's a space for that, but it's not a demand. It's not a demand that all the work should be like that. And which didn't surprise me, but surprised them, that some of the most powerful political statements were the most elliptical.
Yes.
There was a short piece done by Selo Make, who's a street choreographer. In other words, most of his performance happened in the street, although he spends, I think, with his company doing 2 hours of ballet training every morning. But this was, I remember if you saw in one of the shots of the Center for the Less Good Idea, there was the boxing ring, which was our stage in the first season of the center. And we'd hung a heavy bag, and there were different things done on it. But Selo and his company just decided this long improvisation that seemed to go on forever of just attacking the bag with chairs, with all the objects, with buckets, whatever happened to be, kicking it, taking off their shoe and slapping it with their shoe. So it was both comic but very violent. And then almost like a circus act, one of them came up with a bucket and he just started washing it. And suddenly it became this extraordinary piece, which was both about violence and consolation. Of this violence against the bag and so some people found it too violent to watch. They couldn't separate the idea of the attacking there and not seeing it as being done to a human being. And on the one hand, you had something that was just washing a boxing bag, wiping it with a cloth and dripping it into a bucket. But that was also became very moving. So that's kind of when it's working at its best, when it can operate like that.
Yes, and tacking between the metaphorical and the literal, and between your explication of that military figure who is deciding whether to commit bodily, or that boxing ring. I feel like those together all go back to what you were saying earlier about uncertainty in political aesthetics, and the elliptical. I love the
elliptical, and finding something in the body through which to approach it.
Yeah. Right. All right, William, what an extraordinary disquisition already. And I'm going to ask now my team to highlight themselves so that we can start to field some of these incredible questions and comments and connections that are brewing here in our Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much, William. And I know that you can't, Zoom is such an awkward format. You can't feel the energy in the
It's
room.
fine.
But
You're
those
doing
of us
well.
behind the scenes have seen
I know.
comments in the chat and the Q&A. Everyone's really, really electrified by what you have to say.
Good.
So, although you can't hear the
It's
applause.
much more relaxed talking in my studio than being in a lecture hall. So
Oh,
there's
good.
that.
Oh,
One
good.
loses a lot, but one gains that. Also, one doesn't get the annoyance of seeing the stupid person in the third row who's fast asleep, and the person on the fifth row who's busy doing their emails as one's talking.
I
Here one
don't
assumes.
think anybody's asleep.
Well,
No.
I know many people are getting coffee, and some of them can't, like me, couldn't resist checking their phone. I mean, it's an illness we have of being stuck with our screens. That's fine.
So, yeah, so I think I'll start with a fairly open-ended question. One of the
Sure.
attendees was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your influences, particularly if there are certain artists who have been very influential to you.
There have been many, and at different times. So when I was a student, George Gross was very important, and Hogarth. Goya stays as kind of a lodestar through the years. At different times, Philip Guston was very, very important, just as a way of thinking about still life drawing. Chardin and Philip Guston were two kind of, and Morandi were three figures that floated around, but it's more individual works. In the theater world, I was very fortunate once to see a performance of Tadeusz Kantor and his theater. And that made a huge impression on me of how theater could operate, this Polish theater director. I think it was in Berlin it was being performed. Obviously, Jacques Lecoq was extremely important. My first art teacher, Bill Ainsley, a South African artist that you wouldn't necessarily have heard of, was very important in demonstrating what the activity of being an artist was, the doggedness of going on with it all the time. I mean, there are artists like Bruce Nauman who I have a very strong love-hate relationship to. I sort of dislike and like his work in strong measures equally. Or I get annoyed with myself for liking it when I should hate it. Put it that way.
So the students just had an immersion in Nauman last week, so thank you for that.
He is so American. He is so the product of America feeling that they're the kings of the world. That however much he might be a Democrat, there's something unbearably imperialist in his work. The certainty, the confidence in these minimal gestures being enough for anyone to deal with. And I love those gestures, and I know they would be completely impossible not in the art center where they would be given the time of day. So it's a kind of a frustration about what it is to be at the periphery of the art world rather than at the center. This is something I felt much more strongly when in the 1980s and 90s, if you didn't live in New York or in Berlin, to a little extent in Los Angeles, you were not part of the art world and couldn't expect your work to be really seen. That's changed a lot, that has. The biennales around the world, the willingness of curators to travel, even the unhappy fact of art fairs has changed this dynamic. So my feelings about Bruce Nauman are old ones, but I rush everywhere to see his work. It's really wonderful.
Thank you. Edgar?
Yeah. I really appreciate how you're holding these complexities. And I think a lot of people I'm just seeing in the chat really appreciating you sharing that. And I think kind of in line with this, I wanted to share a question from Kelly in the audience that says, even though your art uses the element of uncertainty, are there any certainties that you can always fall back on?
Yes, I mean, it's a certainty of the comfort of the studio. That in times when I've been at my most distressed, being in the studio for a few hours and starting to draw, even if I don't know what it's going to be or how it will turn out, there's somehow a physical solace in what the studio brings. So that's a kind of a certainty. I mean, there are lots of certainties outside of the studio. If you have a family and you've got children and close connections, there's the certainty of those, of course. I'm much less certain on questions. Is this working? Is it not working? I can write the reviews both ways. I can see it each way going. There's a kind of not necessarily force of habit, a reassurance from long experience of a way of working with charcoal, with ink, or tearing paper. That I say, even if it's going badly, I say, just have patience. It'll go somewhere in the end. You don't know where, but you'll see where it goes in the end. So that's not certainty, but it's a kind of calming confidence. So I say to myself, okay, there's always with every project a feeling, okay, this one is definitely going to be a disaster. At 4 a.m, you wake up and you think there's no way that this can't work. And then I used to console myself by saying, yes, that's what you've said at every single bloody project, but somehow almost all of them have managed to get through that and become something, even if you can't see it at the moment. Now I console myself slightly differently. I say, okay, you've done a lot of projects. You're allowed one complete and utter absolute failure, one disaster. So sail into the disaster, and if it comes, that's really not going to be the end of the world. Whereas before, when you're young and you're starting out, a disaster is the end of the world. And it feels it. You feel, how are you ever going to recover? You have to put all your energy into work, and people say, it really didn't really work. You messed that one up, didn't you? That can be devastating. So that's what I say to myself 4 a.m. Okay, maybe it will be a complete disaster, but let's go and see.
Thank you.
So, yeah, so I have a question here that's about the context of South Africa and your sort of role as a South African artist. So Norma asks, I'm curious to hear your views on the Black African relationship to avant-garde or innovative or absurdist art traditions today. Without being too reductionist in this question, I imagine for a white South African, it's easy to see the connection to Europe. Interested to hear your perspective on the Black avant-garde scene.
Well, I'm not quite sure what constitutes the avant-garde scene. I mean, there are dancers that I'm working with that I think are at the forefront of dance anywhere in the world. We have a tradition of jazz musicians that are as fine as anywhere and doing things as innovatively and changing things. So, you know, there's a complicated relationship of South African Black artists to modernism. There's a whole strand of almost American color field painting that came into South Africa in the 1970s, and many artists who've continued with that. And that was partly as a reaction against the demand for topical suburban township scenes. That was the demand of the art market of what you had to make if you were a Black South African artist. In terms of theater, I mean, there's a very wide range of things that people are doing. White people in the theater and Black people in the theater. One has to understand that the resources of what theater making is, whether it's Tadeusz Kantor from Poland or Malian puppets from West Africa, are there and available for everyone. And of course, they get completely inflected by people's particular experience. It's not to say, oh, they're the same works that get made by different artists. Each artist makes work that's so shaped by images that were vital to them, by their family, by conversations about the work. So I can't give a clear answer. I can't quite understand the shape of the question.
Well, thank you. I think it's given us some directions to think about the richness of the South African art scene. So thank you.
Maybe with that, since we're on the topic of the South African art scene, a question from Averitt Coleman, who's the former director of the Cramlett Collection and with Marion Goodman Gallery, is asking, can you speak further about City Deep, about the museum and state of ruin, the specific context of the Johannesburg Art Gallery, but also a broader reflection on time and how we gather to see and exhibit art and reflect our cultures through this?
Okay, so maybe what I'll do while I'm talking, I'll just put on a bit of the film in the background.
Okay, and I'll ask Paris to unspotlight the three of us and spotlight you.
Sorry, let me just find the film. Yeah, this is an early version of City Deep, but it will stand in for it further. So we'll pick it up sort of where we left off. Okay, so Chris, we can let this run. Okay, so City Deep has really two main images in it. The one is of the informal miners, the zama-zamas as they are called, who mine by the thousands in disused mines around the country. And instead of using high-skilled and high, industrial drills and everything, it's done often with a chisel and a hammer. And the rock is mined that way, and then it's crushed under a piece of concrete to turn it into powder, and then it is panned. And this is a way that tens of thousands of people who otherwise would be unemployed make a living on the edges of this huge gold mining industry that's the basis of Johannesburg. The Johannesburg Art Gallery was founded through the beneficence of some of the very wealthy English mine owners who'd come and made their fortune in South Africa and donated various paintings to the gallery. So, and it was the gallery of my childhood. It was where I went to see art. It was what I understood a gallery was. But in the last years, both because of its position in a very rough part of downtown Johannesburg, and because of a lack of city support for it, it's fallen into extraordinary disrepair. The roof, the copper roof, has been stolen several times. So there's huge flooding. There's sections of it which get still used, but other sections which are kind of abandoned. And it's kind of a sadness for me that this museum of my childhood has reached this stage. And so the film doesn't really have an answer, but it puts these two things together, the making of wealth, I suppose, in these objects of value, these little sculptures, and the landscape outside Johannesburg. And so it's about a kind of decline and collapse. Put the sound on. Okay. Okay, that's. I'd be hard pressed to try to say what its final message, if there is a message, or what its final meaning is. It's something about the pleasure of what it is to erase a very carefully drawn interior, like the interior of the gallery, into the dust and the mess of the charcoal that becomes its implosion, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And then the landscape growing back out of this. Obviously, the mining holes that people dig are in a way also graves that have been dug. So whether that's the grave for Soho Eckstein, the character in the film, or not is uncertain. This is me doing a kind of interpretation of the film after the event, which I'm very skeptical of.
It's interesting to think about it also just adjacent to another work that's in the Cramlet collection, Other Faces. I'm just thinking about yes. the outdoor cinema too, as a space yes. of cultural gathering.
So just to give a context of that, Johannesburg, our hills were always made by what came out of the ground, the tailings of the mines. So normally it would be pretty flat, there'd be a few ridges, but around the southern side of the city, all my childhood, there were these hills, which were these yellow flat-topped hills, which still contained traces of gold in them. So over the last 20 years or so, maybe even 30 years, as gold price changes and as metallurgy becomes more sophisticated, they've all been reprocessed. So the mountains have been literally cut away and turned into a slurry and the gold extracted. Now the movie screen in Other Faces, maybe I can even show you that sequence, was a real movie screen outside Johannesburg on the southern edges. This is a very low res version, I'm afraid. No, it's gone away. Okay. Okay, so there's the movie screen. And then later on in the film, which is showing, in this case, home movies of my family and me. And here you see those mine dumps disappearing. And there was, in fact, a mine dump, a movie screen on top of one of these mine dumps. And the movie screen was a national monument, but the mine dump, the mountain on which it placed, was not. So gradually the mine dump, this mountain, was excavated all around it until this movie screen, which was a national monument, couldn't actually sustain itself and collapsed. So although it's a kind of metaphoric image in the film of this memory and of childhood disappearing, it's in fact based on this strange, absurd story of this movie, of this drive-in cinema.
Yeah, but again, that's sort of how the absurdity of politics works, that like in the midst of seeing a movie that you also are, experiencing that atop this incredibly fraught history.
Right.
All right, that was exquisite. Thank you for that, for going down that road with us. Casey and Edgar, can we propose perhaps a couple of more questions as we're
I have one that's actually a pretty good continuation on from that, in that it also has to do with cinema, although very early cinema. So this question is about Edward Muybridge. I'm going to read it out. It's a few sentences long, but I think it provides some good context. So Warren writes, "It's been written that Mr. Kentridge's work is informed by the stop motion photography of Edward Muybridge, but Kentridge pushes the technical and stylistic effects towards producing a dialectic of truth. On the technical and political, Mr. Kentridge has noted Muybridge's use of an African-American jockey for The Horse in Motion, made at the height of the Jim Crow laws in the US, a kind of analog to apartheid-era South Africa. I wonder if Mr. Kentridge would comment further on what Muybridge means to his practice today, for example, or for example, the head and the load."
Yeah, so, I mean, Muybridge's books on human and animal locomotion are like a Bible still for animators. I mean, now I suppose with YouTube and National Geographic and a million different sources of seeing films on your screen, which you can stop and look at frame by frame, it's not as vital as it was 30 or 20 years ago. But if you actually want to see how a horse walked, that was kind of the fallback position. There's also something about the graininess of those tiny photos and the grid of lines that went through them that was kind of wonderful graphically. I mean, Francis Bacon, the English painter, used them a lot, both spatially, but also for the figures for the two men wrestling, which he turned into an erotic encounter. And so even if the images that I'm working don't necessarily directly come from Muybridge, and there's several which have over the years, there's something of their sparseness, which has been fantastic for me to use. The fact that they were produced at the time of Jim Crow is an interesting footnote, but for me that's a footnote apart from what they actually have to offer. You know, it's not as if his series of the thousands of photographs of men and women, usually naked, were done of African Americans, in which case you would say, why is that the particular body that is chosen in its nakedness to represent the world. That is not the case with him. I didn't remember, and I don't remember the jockey on the horse. And as I say, that's an interesting note. I'll go and get out my Muybridge and look at it. Yeah, I mean, I can show you a fragment of a bird that is very indebted to Muybridge. It's just it's a sequence of maybe 12 ink drawings. Okay. So I'm pretty sure that comes from looking at a page of Muybridge birds, and then painting them very roughly with this Indian ink.
It seems like looking at that, it also goes back to the investigation of time, where you're talking about your work with Peter Gallison earlier, that there was something about the Muybridge practice that helped us think about what time was, and that you're recalling that, at least with those birds.
It is. I mean, I think one of the things that, yeah, that's fine. Thanks. One of the things about real role of film is that it's such a concrete way of turning time, which is something invisible, into something very weighable. I mean, not this. This is maybe 30 seconds of film, but a normal film canister, which weighs about half a pound, or about 800 grams, a pound and a bit, is 4 minutes. So you feel in your hand you're holding 4 minutes of film. Here I am holding maybe 30 seconds. I mean, it also turns time into distance. So you can say that is the length of a Hollywood kiss, and that's the length of a long Hollywood kiss. So these ephemeral things turn into things that are very specific and concrete. So there's something that one misses in the digital world, because that stays so ephemeral. You don't turn time into something concrete, it stays invisible. Whereas in the world of celluloid film, it goes through this miraculous kind of transformation. And I suppose that's why I'm interested in the physicality of art making, the materiality of it. And often, of course, when I'm editing on a computer, and these days the films are actually shot digitally, which is a sadness, but it would be impossible to work in another way. I mean, there are no film laboratories in Johannesburg, in South Africa anymore. Yeah, so it's, but Muybridge and film obviously go together, both in terms of the grain, in terms of the successiveness of it, in terms of the movement, the prehistory of what cinema became.
Absolutely.
I'm very interested in that prehistory of cinema, different ways of thinking of cinema, whether you think of cinema's history being a development of photography, or whether you think of cinema as being an extension of performances of transformation, of the vaudeville history of transforming things in front of an audience. And cinema just becomes the most sophisticated and then versatile and then all-conquering version of this.
Yeah, absolutely. That the different genealogies that contributed to your practice or practice like these is always interesting. And then you almost understand these forms differently depending on whether you measure its distance from photography versus measuring its distance from drawing versus measuring its distance from performance. Edgar, do you have another question for us queued up?
I do, yeah, especially, as you bring up the materiality of art making, I'd love to invite Hala Kadura, who's one of our first-year MFA art practice students, has a question, and she'd like to ask it live. So I'm gonna unmute.
Sure.
If you want to unmute yourself, Hala.
Thank you so much, Edgar, and thank you so much, William, for this presentation. Thank you, Shannon and Casey. My question is, as an emerging artist and with my first studio, my body is pushing me towards working with images, collages, and paint, also movement and performance. I still don't have the language to explain what I'm doing. However, my body feels it and feels at home while I'm working and playing. However, my mind wants to be certain of the end product. I would love to know more about your process of creating work. How do you start a project? I'm really inspired by the work you do, and especially because my work also talks about apartheid and settler colonialism. However, it's in the state of Israel. And my last question, because I think it's a lot of questions, did you ever experience censorship because of the work you do? Thank you so much.
I think, okay, so let me start with the last question about censorship. In South Africa, under apartheid, there was very strong censorship of cinema and of news. And we only had television from 1975. Up till then, television was seen as too dangerous and it was not allowed in South Africa. But there were a lot of novels by Nadine Gordimer and other writers, white and black authors whose work was banned. And there was censorship of newspapers. The visual arts in general were seen as so marginal that you really had to go out of your way to be censored. There was one South African artist who did a painting of the Last Supper in which Christ is depicted wearing a Christmas hat. And that was deemed to be blasphemous, but that was in the 1960s. Political posters may have been stopped. All films had to be sent to the publications control board. And I remember there was one of my films, an early one called Johannesburg, Second Greatest City After Paris, that was sent because we wanted to show it at a local festival. And it came back with the report, and things were either censored for political or sexual reasons, for political or sexual content. And this came back from the Publications Control Board saying, this film contains scenes of fellatio and cunnilingus. However, they are sufficiently badly drawn not to give offense. And the film was allowed through. So the harder question about how does one start? I think it's very hard when you start out not to want to know that you're going to have an end product. And partly for me, I would do that through lists. So in our first exhibition, it was a series of prints and I chose an arbitrary number. I'm going to make a suite of 30 prints of domestic scenes, masters and servants in Johannesburg. And so that gave a kind of a shape to the project. In the end, I think there were 50 and I selected 30 and that became the basis for the work. So I still write a lot of lists as things go. If I had to make the film now, what would the 8 scenes be? Knowing those won't be the final 8 scenes, but listing them and putting them down, committing to those names. And I may find after a week I've done 2 of those and the other 6 have disappeared and there are 4 new names. But it's been very helpful to have written those items down. So that would be I'm a great believer in lists, even if you don't listen to the list.
Thank you. Casey, maybe a final question before we start to close things toward the end.
Yeah, well, we have a question that's sort of about opening out towards the future. This attendee asks about the artists that you're excited about right now, and also about what you're working on right now.
Well, what I'm working on right now, which has been my big lockdown project, is a series of films about what happens in the studio, about making sense in the studio. And the idea is that in the end, there'll be 9 40-minute films or 45-minute films on different themes. That's kind of similar to things we've been talking about tonight, about certainty, memory, landscape, fate, all of those kinds of things. Initially, it was made just with Chris. Come and stand here. Chris has been helping to shoot this, was sort of the lockdown companion in the studio, and we made the first several of the films together. Now there's a slightly larger crew, and Chris has been organizing everything here tonight in the studio. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
So and that will take, so we've done about half of the episodes now, but it's another year's work. So that'll take me through, and hopefully by the end of next year, travel will be possible, vaccination will be possible. We'll be at the end of COVID in Johannesburg or in South Africa. Maybe optimistic, but that's the hope. But it's also been remarkable, it's been fantastic having kind of a year uninterrupted in the studio and without all the usual travels for either performances or exhibitions. So that's kind of the present and the future of these projects. I always keep every few years making one of the drawings for projection. That's sort of my treat to myself after a long period to go back to basics, working on that.
William, you've been incredibly generous with your time, and it's such a privilege to hear about what is basic for you. And also to think more about what's ahead, as well as the complexity of thinking and wondering and doubting that has underscored so much of your work. It's, I think it's inspiring and heartening to have that kind of sensibility at a time that is so confusing, because confusion seems like something we can actually generate our work from, rather than allow ourselves to be short-circuited by. I want to thank you. I want to thank Chris and your team, including Anne as well. I want to thank my team, Paris, Edgar, and Casey. I also do want to thank the Kramlich Art Foundation once again for bringing so much together. I believe Pam Kramlich is here with us today. Pam, thank you so much for what you bring together.
Well, I want to thank William, you for contributing so much to what the program is that Shannon is anxious to have, and that is you're just the consummate educator, and I think also such a wonderful inspiration for all of us in so many ways. And I know you talked to me a little bit about how do we protect this material. So we're still, I want to let you know that we're working on that very, very hard, because we do know that film is fragile, and paper is fragile. All these things are fragile. And you talked about things, you know, how things end in our lives. And anyway, I think that that's a big journey I'm on. And I hope we can succeed. I realize too, you have to start somewhere. You don't know if you're going to be able to do it. And you give a lot of inspiration around that kind of effort. And we're going to keep plugging along. So anyway,
thank you, Pam.
Thank you so much.
That's very kind.
Thank you.
It is absolutely the puzzle and struggle and challenge, but also just such an interesting process to think about preservation and about what it is to hold on to these materials that inspire us and that actually can do things that the newer digital tools can't always do. But so, as Pam said, in the midst of all the thanks for all of the collaborators who make this possible, in the midst of thanking all of the people who came here to lend your energy and your sense of wonder to our event, help me thank the incredible William Kentridge. It, as I told him, was a highlight of my own career to be able to be in dialogue today. I know it's been a highlight for all of you. Thank you, William, for being you.
Thank you, Shannon. That's been a lovely conversation.
We're all clapping.
Thank you, all of you. Thank you, all of you.
Okay, and someday we'll clap again in the theater.
Good.
Okay, thank you.
Good. Bye.
Bye-bye.